The medical center had an impeccable reputation. Private surgical facility specializing in transplant procedures, state-of-the-art equipment, board-certified surgeons, success rates that exceeded national averages. Located in an upscale medical district, the clinic served wealthy patients who could afford premium health care. Waiting lists for legitimate transplants could take years through public systems. This clinic promised faster access through their international donor network. The facility's medical director was a respected figure in the transplant community. Published research, conference presentations, consulting work for major hospitals. His credentials were beyond question. The clinic operated transparently with regular inspections and accreditation reviews. Everything appeared legitimate, professional, ethical. But federal investigators had been tracking anomalies for 9 months. Missing persons cases with a disturbing pattern, individuals, primarily homeless, undocumented immigrants, or people with minimal family connections, disappearing after being approached by medical recruiters. The recruiters offered paid participation in medical studies, health screenings with compensation, or treatment for existing conditions at no cost. Most missing persons cases went cold quickly. No witnesses, no evidence of foul play. People on society's margins simply vanished, and limited resources meant investigations stalled. But a family member of one missing person refused to give up. Her brother had been homeless, struggling with addiction, but they maintained contact. When he mentioned participating in a medical study that would pay enough for him to get into treatment, she encouraged him. Then he disappeared. She filed reports, provided the medical recruiter's contact information, described the facility he mentioned, an upscale clinic in the medical district. Initial police response was limited. Adult chose to participate in a study, probably relapsed and left the area. But she persisted, contacted federal authorities, provided documentation of her brother's communications before he vanished. FBI investigators began examining the clinic. Financial records showed international wire transfers inconsistent with normal medical practice revenue. Payments from overseas accounts with no corresponding documented services. The clinic reported performing transplant surgeries, but the number of procedures exceeded what their documented donor network could supply. Medical licensing boards were contacted. The clinic's transplant volume raised questions. Where were the organs coming from? Legitimate donation channels were tracked carefully. Deceased donors, living donors with documented consent, all with paper trails and oversight. The clinic's numbers didn't match available supply through legal channels. Undercover investigators posed as potential patients seeking transplants. They were told the clinic had access to international donor networks. Wait times would be minimal, weeks instead of years. Costs were high, but service was guaranteed. No questions about the donor source. No verification of ethical procurement. Just payment and scheduling. The pattern became clear. The clinic was performing transplants. The organs had to come from somewhere. Legitimate supply couldn't account for the volume. Missing persons connected to medical recruiters. Financial transfers from countries known for organ trafficking. The pieces suggested a horrifying possibility. The clinic was using forced donors. Federal warrants were obtained, but intelligence gathering continued. A raid on a functioning medical facility required certainty. False accusations against a legitimate operation would be devastating. But the evidence mounted. Surveillance identified the recruiters. They operated in homeless encampments, addiction treatment centers, immigrant communities. Promises of paid medical participation, transportation to the breakthrough came from financial forensics. Payments to the medical director traced to shell companies connected to international organ trafficking networks. Communications intercepted. Through court-authorized surveillance discussed procurement, inventory, and scheduled harvesting. The language was clinical. The tactical planning was complex. The clinic operated 24 hours with surgical suites, recovery rooms, and patient care areas. Legitimate patients might be present, individuals who had received transplants believing the organs came from ethical sources. Staff might be complicit or ignorant. The facility had to be secured without endangering anyone receiving legitimate medical care. Intelligence indicated the clinic's basement level wasn't accessible to regular patients. Security required biometric access. Surveillance showed individuals being taken down but never seen leaving. Thermal imaging detected heat signatures suggesting occupied rooms in areas that shouldn't contain patients according to the clinic's licensed floor plans. The operation required medical expertise on the tactical team. Physicians and nurses prepared to assess anyone found and determine if they were patients, donors, or victims. Ambulances staged nearby. Trauma surgeons on standby. The raid might discover people in medical distress requiring immediate intervention. The warrant was executed at dawn. Multiple entry points secured simultaneously. The main entrance. Emergency exits. Loading dock where medical supplies arrived. The building was isolated within 90 seconds. Staff arriving for shift changes were detained and separated. Patients in recovery rooms were secured and evaluated. All appeared to be legitimate transplant recipients unaware of the organ source. The clinic's main floors appeared normal. Surgical suites equipped with standard transplant technology. Recovery rooms meeting medical standards. Administrative offices with patient files and billing records. Everything looked like a legitimate medical facility. The staff detained seemed genuinely confused by the tactical presence. But the basement was different. Access required bypassing biometric locks. The tactical team used override codes obtained through the warrant process. The door opened to reveal a stairwell descending below ground level. At the bottom was a corridor with medical lighting and sealed doors. This wasn't public space. This was hidden infrastructure. The first room was opened. Inside was a recovery area, but not for transplant recipients. For donors, 3 people were present, all showing recent surgical scars. IV lines connected, monitoring equipment, tracking vitals, but they weren't conscious volunteers. Medical records found in the room indicated forced procedures, blood type testing, tissue matching, organ removal schedules. When roused, their stories were consistent, recruited with promises of paid medical studies, brought to the clinic, given health screenings that were actually tissue typing, told they would be compensated, then sedated, waking up with surgical wounds, missing kidneys, pieces of liver removed, told they had consented and were being held for recovery, threatened that leaving would mean arrest for breach of contract or immigration violations. They had been there for varying periods. One person had been in the facility for 6 days post-surgery, another for 3 days. The third was scheduled for a second procedure, removal of the remaining kidney. The medical records were clinical and cold. Tissue match for overseas buyer, scheduled extraction, expected recovery period, disposal planning for non-viable donors. The second room held 5 more people, pre-operative holding. They had been recruited, tested, matched with recipients, and were awaiting surgical procedures. Some believed they were still participating in paid studies. Others had realized the truth and were being held against their will. Sedation was used to maintain control. Medical staff told them cooperation meant survival. Resistance meant being declared medically unsuitable and processed accordingly. The third room was operating preparation, surgical equipment, anesthesia stations. Everything needed to perform organ removal procedures. Schedules posted on a wall showed 3 procedures planned for that day. Start times. Patient, identified only by blood type and tissue markers. Organ to be harvested. Recipient location. International destinations. The fourth room was worse. Medical waste disposal. But not standard biohazard materials. Human remains. People who had been used as forced donors until they were no longer viable. Cause of death varied. Surgical complications, organ failure after removal of too much tissue, or deliberate termination once they had nothing left to harvest. The bodies were prepared for disposal through cremation services that asked no questions. The discovery transformed the raid into a mass rescue and homicide investigation. The 8 people found alive in the holding and recovery rooms were immediately classified as trafficking victims. Medical teams began assessment and treatment. All required ongoing care for surgical procedures performed without proper consent or follow-up. But the facility's records suggested more victims. Operating logs showed procedures performed over the past 18 months. 73 organ removal surgeries documented. 8 people found alive. The disposal room contained remains of at least 6 individuals. That left 59 people unaccounted for. Some might have survived and been released. Others were likely dead and disposed of through channels not yet discovered. The medical director was arrested at his home. No resistance. He maintained professional composure, claimed the procedures were all consensual, insisted documentation would prove legal compliance, but the evidence told a different story. Communications with international buyers, financial records showing payments per organ, recruitment materials targeting vulnerable populations, medical files tracking inventory of potential donors. His staff was detained and interviewed. The nurses and technicians working in the basement facility knew the truth. They participated in forced procedures. They sedated unwilling donors. They monitored post-operative patients who were prisoners rather than volunteers. Some claimed coercion, threatened with exposure of immigration status or professional license violations if they refused to participate. Others showed no remorse, treating organ harvesting as simply another medical procedure. The clinic's legitimate operations on the main floors had been a perfect cover. Real transplant surgeries performed for wealthy patients using organs harvested from forced donors in the basement. The patients upstairs had no idea. They paid premium prices believing they were receiving ethically sourced organs through international donation networks. Instead, they received kidneys and liver segments taken from people held captive in rooms below the legitimate surgical suites. Federal prosecutors coordinated with international authorities. The organ recipients were located in 7 countries. Most were unaware of the source. They had worked through medical tourism agencies and intermediaries. But the buyers had to be confronted with the truth. Their transplants involved trafficking victims and forced donation. The 8 survivors required extensive support, medical care for complications from non-consensual surgeries, psychological treatment for trauma, legal assistance to address immigration status for those who were undocumented, housing and social services for individuals who had been homeless before recruitment, victim compensation to address the permanent physical harm from organ removal. Their testimony was critical for prosecution. They described the recruitment process, the promises made, the realization that consent was manufactured through deception or force, the procedures performed while they were sedated and helpless, the post-operative threats that kept them compliant, the knowledge that others hadn't survived. One survivor, the person scheduled for second kidney removal, had been hours from a procedure that would have killed him. Removing both kidneys without dialysis access meant death. The medical records were explicit. Extract second kidney. Monitor for 24 hours. Terminate and dispose. He was scheduled for surgery that afternoon. The raid happened at dawn. He was 8 hours from execution disguised as medical procedure. The investigation expanded to track the missing 59 people. Some were located alive. They had undergone single organ removal, recovered in the basement facility, and been released with threats to stay silent. They were terrified to come forward, believing the clinic's claims that they had signed consent forms and faced legal consequences for reporting. Investigators found 12 survivors through missing persons databases and direct outreach. All confirmed forced procedures. All carried permanent physical damage. The others remained missing. Investigators worked through disposal records, cremation service logs, and unidentified remains in regional morgues. The grim work of identifying victims who hadn't survived the trafficking operation. Families were notified. Missing persons cases were closed with the worst possible outcomes. The medical director faced federal charges: human trafficking, conspiracy, murder, operating an illegal organ trafficking network. The evidence was overwhelming. Operating room logs, financial records documenting payment per organ, communications discussing procurement and disposal, survivor testimony describing forced procedures. His defense attempted to claim consent, but the victims had been recruited through deception, told they would be compensated for participation in studies, not informed they would undergo permanent organ removal, sedated without understanding the procedures being performed, held against their will during recovery, threatened to prevent reporting. Legal consent required informed voluntary agreement. Nothing about the operation met that standard. The trial revealed the scope. Over 18 months, the clinic had performed 73 forced organ removal procedures, generated over $4 million in revenue, caused permanent harm to dozens of victims, killed at least 20 people through surgical complications or deliberate termination, operated beneath a veneer of medical respectability in an upscale clinic where legitimate patients received care on the floors above the hidden trafficking operation. The medical director was convicted on all counts, sentenced to life without parole. His medical license was revoked. His surgical staff who participated knowingly received sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years. Those who cooperated and provided testimony about coercion received reduced sentences but faced permanent professional consequences. The clinic was shut down. Assets were seized through civil forfeiture. The building was sold with proceeds directed to victim compensation funds. Legitimate patients who had received organs from the trafficking operation were offered medical monitoring and psychological support. Most were devastated to learn the source of their transplants. The case prompted reforms in transplant regulation, enhanced oversight of private surgical facilities, mandatory reporting of transplant procedures to national databases, investigation protocols for facilities performing higher volumes than their documented donor networks should support, background checks for medical recruiters, protection for individuals reporting suspected organ trafficking. But the immediate impact was the rescue. 8 people found in the basement facility, all alive because the raid happened before scheduled procedures could be completed. The person scheduled for second kidney removal was freed 8 hours before surgery. Others were recovering from recent forced procedures but alive and able to receive proper medical care. The families of the deceased victims received closure. The missing persons cases that had gone cold were solved. The remains were identified and returned for proper burial. The families learned the horrible truth but at least had answers instead of endless uncertainty. The survivors faced long recovery, physical healing from surgeries performed without proper medical ethics, psychological trauma from captivity and forced procedures, reintegration into society after being treated as medical inventory. Support services provided comprehensive assistance, but the permanent nature of organ removal meant lifelong impact. Some survivors became advocates, speaking about their experiences to raise awareness of organ trafficking, working with legislators on regulatory reforms, providing testimony in related cases, turning their trauma into purpose by helping prevent others from becoming victims. The medical district where the clinic operated faced scrutiny. How had a trafficking operation functioned for 18 months in a regulated healthcare environment? The answer revealed gaps in oversight. Private facilities had less monitoring than public hospitals. Accreditation focused on equipment and procedures, not verification of organ sources. Financial reporting didn't require documentation of international transfers. The regulatory framework assumed good faith compliance and lacked mechanisms to detect sophisticated criminal operations. Changes were implemented. Surprise inspections of private surgical facilities, financial audits examining revenue sources, mandatory reporting of all organ transplant procedures with verification of donor sources, whistleblower protections for medical staff reporting suspicious practices. The reforms aimed to prevent similar operations from hiding behind medical legitimacy. But for the tactical teams who executed the raid, the memory remained vivid. The basement corridor, the recovery room with post-operative victims, the holding room with people awaiting forced procedures, the disposal area with remains of those who hadn't survived, the operating room schedules showing procedures planned for that day. The clinic had looked legitimate. The medical director was respected. The facility was accredited. Everything appeared professional and ethical. But beneath the surface, hidden in a basement accessible only through biometric locks, was a trafficking operation treating human beings as organ inventory. The SWAT teams had entered expecting to find evidence of illegal transplants. They found a hidden medical facility holding 8 people in various stages of forced donation. They found operating schedules showing procedures planned for that day. They found disposal records indicating dozens of victims who hadn't survived. The raid stopped the operation 8 hours before the next scheduled surgery. 8 hours before a person would have been taken to the operating room for removal of his second kidney. 8 hours before forced organ harvesting would have killed another victim. The door was breached. The basement was discovered. The victims were found. And a trafficking operation disguised as prestigious medical care was exposed and dismantled. The clinic is gone. The building now houses a community health center providing free medical services to the populations that had been targeted for trafficking. The transformation is deliberate, replacing exploitation with legitimate care, serving those who had been viewed as disposable organ sources with proper medical support and dignity. But the survivors carry permanent reminders, surgical scars from procedures they never consented to, missing organs that will never regenerate, health complications from surgeries performed without proper ethics or follow-up care, lives forever altered by a trafficking operation that treated them as medical commodities rather than human beings. The raid saved 8 people from continued exploitation. It stopped procedures scheduled for that day. It exposed a network that had operated for 18 months. It brought justice for victims and consequences for perpetrators. And it revealed how deeply criminal operations can embed themselves in legitimate institutions when respectability provides cover and vulnerable populations are viewed as exploitable rather than protected. The medical director had credentials, reputation, and professional standing. The clinic had accreditation, modern equipment, and satisfied patients. Everything looked legitimate. Everything signaled quality medical care, except in the basement, where 8 people were being held, where operating schedules planned forced procedures, where disposal protocols addressed victims who didn't survive, where organ trafficking operated beneath a veneer of medical excellence. The tactical teams found them 8 hours before the next surgery, in a facility that had been killing people for profit while maintaining a reputation for life-saving transplants. The raid stopped it. The victims were freed. The operation was dismantled. And the basement that had been a hidden trafficking center was emptied of its prisoners and exposed to the justice system that would hold the perpetrators accountable for treating human beings as harvestable medical resources.